and welcome to another exciting episode of the Geo Trip. I am here today with my co-host, Dr. Prince, and joining us is our guest, Mel Zhang. Mel has had what can be considered an interdisciplinary approach to academia and life in general, and believes that categorizations are mainly illusionary. Can't wait to get into that. After getting her bachelor's degree in environmental studies from UC Santa Barbara, Mel took some time to explore her dynamic self before obtaining her master's degree in geology from CU Boulder, so Colorado University in Boulder, where she focused on the seismology of shallow subduction zones. Currently, Mel studies surface processes using geophysical techniques, aka environmental seismology, and has a keen interest in progressing academia and science towards equitable access, representation, and inclusivity. Mel's doing this amazing work at Colorado School of Mines. And when she's not working on this, on weekends, she can be found juggling, rock climbing, or hanging upside down from something. Welcome, Mel.
Thanks for inviting me.
Mel, we're so excited to talk to you because you truly are a dynamic scientist. But before we begin, can you tell us and our audience a little bit about your geo story and the route you took to get to your current institution?
Yes, totally. I feel like I hear people say this a lot, but, or at least maybe just people that I know and talk to, but it was really not a straight shot for me. And I didn't even really know what education in geology looked like or know that that was an option for me until well into, I would say, my young adulthood. And this is all despite kind of, as a young child, always having an interest in just like looking at ants outside of my house and just like collecting rocks and stirring mud with sticks. These are things that I chose to do as a really young child and didn't really know why. And it was just something that made me happy. And I didn't grow up doing outdoorsy things. My parents didn't really raise us to have much of an interest in spending time in nature. We never camped or really did any hiking or other outdoor recreation. So I don't know. I don't really know where my interest came from. I think it's just kind of I've just always been fascinated by aspects of the natural world, but didn't grow up in a way where that was intentionally fostered. And so I didn't really think of it as something that I would pursue in formal education. You know, when I was an undergrad, I initially entered in as an undeclared major because I really just didn't know what I was doing. And it was just kind of a family expectation that I go and get a bachelor's degree. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I think, maybe 1.5 years in, decided to major in environmental studies because I did have an interest in environmental stewardship and just thought that there were ways that we could exist as humans that were a little bit more in tune with what nature intended. And I thought we weren't really doing that. So I would go and learn more about it. And I worked in the student program at my school for worm composting and also for recycling. So I was kind of immersed in that culture a little bit as an undergraduate. But the whole earth science thing wasn't really something that was on my mind still. I had some friends who were majoring in geology, and I was just like, that sounds cool. Like, don't know anything about that. So I can't really imagine myself doing it. And I took a couple of geology classes and again, kind of thought the material was super cool. We went on really awesome field trips that were super memorable for me. And I thought it was all very interesting. And I still just kind of thought of myself as like not really having the right kind of background for that. And I didn't feel like I was set up for that kind of career or anything. So again, it was just not really something that I considered pursuing in a formal sense. And then at the same time, like I said, there were some really memorable field trips that we went on. I took a class that took us to Death Valley in Southern California. And it wasn't just being there, like them taking us there and seeing it, that was really interesting to me. It was also just the whole aspect of getting educated on why things looked the way that they looked and having someone explain how it came to be that way. And that was the most interesting part for me. So I did end up actually taking a field program in the summer between my junior and senior years as an undergrad. And the field program took us to southeastern Alaska and I was there for 2 months. So like 8 weeks straight of backpacking. And for someone who'd never actually gone camping before, it was really like culture shock for me, but still definitely one of the most memorable times in my life to date. And that made a huge impression on me. And at that point, I was, about to go into my senior year. It was pretty close to graduating with my bachelor's degree. So it kind of just remained that experience with the field program mostly just remained in the back of my mind as something that made a huge impression on me. And as I went on with my life after graduating, I was doing a bunch of other things. I was focusing heavily on my artistic side. I was pursuing circus art really intensely and not, being an academic again was like nowhere near the top of my priority list for a few years after getting my bachelor's degree. And it was eventually, I think, a friend of mine telling me that she was applying to grad school for occupational therapy and preparing for the GRE and everything. And then also another friend of mine kind of getting me on board with enrolling in a community college in Oakland, California, where I was living, and going to welding classes there. So it kind of got me more in the spirit again of being in a formal learning environment. And I started going to the community college. I learned how to weld. I also took some science and math classes there that I didn't have on my transcript at that time because I looked into what the requirements were to apply for geology master's programs and saw that, a lot of people say that you should have a certain level of math and science. And I didn't have some of those classes at the time on my transcript. So I kind of, I guess, caught up on those. People call them deficiencies sometimes, but I don't really like to think of them that way. I I didn't have those classes on my transcript because when I was still an undergrad, I looked at what the differences were between getting a BA and a BS. and I chose BA because I didn't want to deal with the extra science and math. And you couldn't have convinced me to do an undergrad research thesis or anything extra like that. I was kind of just not interested in doing all the extra stuff at that point in my academic career. So here was me a few years later, kind of thinking like, oh, well, maybe this is actually something that I want to do. And, now that I've like taken some distance and time away from academia, I'm kind of looking at it in a bit of a different way and thinking that I could jump back in. So I did end up, I kind of caught up on those classes and applied to grad school. I took the GRE and ended up getting into a program. And that's how I wound up at the University of Colorado Boulder, where I did my master's in geology, Master of Science in Geology. As for getting into the PhD position that I am in now at the Colorado School of Mines, that was not, again, it was not really a thought that crossed my mind. It was never part of the plan until much later. Like I was a master's student. It was incredibly hard. It was one of the hardest times of my life for many reasons. And I was definitely really struggling in certain ways. But by the time I was getting through my second year as a master's student, I was starting to feel like I could do this grad school thing. And I was starting to get a handle on it. And I felt like I could do it better. So that's kind of where the idea of doing a PhD came from. I was kind of in this place of, wow, this felt so like wrong and so hard when I first started my master's. And now I'm kind of seeing that, yes, I'm able to adapt and learn, and I am getting better, and I'm putting a ton of hard work into this. And I think I could actually do this really well. So then, just went ahead and like started applying to, some potential PhD programs and finding advisors that I was interested in, and I ended up getting in. So that's how I wound up at the School of Mines.
That is an incredible summation of an incredible story. There's a whole lot to unpack there.
Yeah. So just to, just to kind of summarize, because Mel, I love your story, right? Just to summarize what you shared with the audience and us, you essentially started this journey not being sure, not necessarily considering yourself a geoscientist or even wanting to be a geoscientist, went through your bachelor's because it was kind of expected, did what you needed to do, but then you took a break and you went on this adventure and I'm bringing this adventure because I would love for you to share a little bit more with us before we actually get into your research. You went into this adventure regarding the art of circus, where you had like this dynamic side to you. And I actually still have the pleasure of seeing it displayed when you whiz across campus, which we'll also touch on. And then you decided that, yeah, you're thinking about grad school. And I like how you reframed it. So it's not that about deficiencies. It's at the time you didn't do it. So you're taking the steps you need to make sure that you're qualified. And all of this is great for our students or non-traditional students who are thinking about going back to school, because you're really just telling us that, you know what, you got this idea in your head, you started to research, and then you really started to unpack and do the work to get there. And that's even how you continued through to a PhD. So before we get into even just, thinking about your actual scientific research, do you mind sharing a little bit with us about what the art of circus, like what that experience was like? Because I feel like all of this really all of these experiences really shape us as scientists, right?
Yeah, I'm definitely happy to share about the circus arts and that whole side. You could probably tell this already from my story and my bio and everything, but I don't really believe in only being one thing. And I don't believe in letting go of things that you're really passionate about in sacrifice for something else. So I've always kind of been someone who has tried to do it all. And, um, you know, it doesn't always, you can't always do everything, but I've definitely spent a lot of my life figuring out where that balance is for myself and how I can still do many of the things that I really care about without giving any of them up and without doing a really bad job at any one of them. And the circus thing, that kind of came into my life. I didn't go and seek it out. But when I was back in my undergrad, it just kind of happened this way. I I was, I think, in my just before my junior year, I moved into the housing co-op system, which is a really cool thing that UC, or University of California, Santa Barbara, has. But there's a student co-op housing network there, and so I moved into one of the co-op houses, and it was this giant house that used to be a frat house, and now it was full of hippies who were mostly students. And I met some roommates there who were fire spinners, and they taught me how to spin poi. They taught me how to fire dance. They got me into performing for the first time. And I just kind of, you know, I found it, or it found me, and I was super into it. It was like really, really just like fulfilling for me in certain aspects. And I just kind of got obsessed with it. And I've just been doing, honing my art and kind of progressing my skills in that department ever since, um, without really taking a break. It's just kind of been a part of my life ever since. And it led to kind of other pursuits, like in the world of circus arts. There's many crafts that you can pursue, and I started with the fire dancing aspect, and that eventually led me to learning how to juggle, learning how to do aerial arts, which is, in case you're not familiar with that, aerial is the art of basically hanging from various different things at a certain height above the ground, and doing acrobatic tricks in the air, essentially. So it's a movement art, and it's a very full body kind of sport.
That's a little more upper body strength than I think I have. But Mel, so you've had all of these varied experiences. You had Death Valley, Alaska, then you've been exploring all of these artistic pursuits. Do you feel like these experiences have complemented you as you pursue a career as a scientist?
I definitely believe that it has. And the way that I mostly observe that in myself is that it has really been a big part of informing my overall perspective. And um, just having a really established life outside of my scientific life, in which I pursue things that are really not related to my science at all. It's been really valuable for me in exposing me to many different kinds of people, and all of the perspectives that those people bring on just life in general, but also I find it really valuable to be immersed in non-scientific communities and just not, be around different kinds of people and be around people who have varied interests. For me, it's really, well, it's a couple different things. It's really refreshing for me to have separation from science. I don't want my whole entire, living and breathing experience to be in the scientific world. That's just not who I am. But also another aspect of it is, I think, just that the people in different communities that I find myself socializing and engaging in, being around those different people with different priorities also does in some ways inform how I think about science. And I think it's really valuable as a scientist to know what, and to talk to people and to know what people outside of the scientific community are thinking about and what's important to them and what their day-to-day looks like. Because I think we can't really do good science if we don't take ourselves out of that very small subset of people in the world in general.
I really love that response, Mel, because I too, as a scientist, think about my science being informed by my identity and not just wanting my identity to be one thing, but wanting it to be this dynamic thing where, aside from research, there is Liaiko or Geo, the person, and who I am with my friends, my family, and the technical work that I do. And I know that's very similar for you. So I actually want to segue us a little bit to start to talk about your research because one of the things I think the audience will realize and be super fascinated about, like I am, is how your research really reflects these thoughts that you have, where you don't want to just be pigeonholed by one thing. So can you share a little bit with us about what you're working on currently for your PhD research and just, I guess, your career overall? Because it has so many different pathways it can go.
Yeah. So while PhD research tends to be very niche and very, very topic specific, and maybe not super well understood by anybody who's not you, I think the best way to frame this is to kind of start with the broad picture and then zoom into what I'm really actually doing on a daily basis. And the really kind of biggest picture of everything to do with my work is that we are surface dwelling creatures on the surface of the earth. And so there's many reasons that it's important to understand Earth's surface processes and not just relating to humans and how we interact with our environment, but how everything is related on the surface of the Earth. And, I say that, but like it's a super complicated, super broad way of putting it because there are so many aspects of surface processes. But just to kind of break that down a little bit, surface process science involves studying everything from the atmosphere to biological organisms to the soil and the actual Earth's solid surface, soil and bedrock, water, but also how all of those things interact. And they interact in very many ways. So, to get a little bit more zoomed into what I do study the interaction between the atmosphere and the biosphere and the geosphere. So, what I focus on is specifically the process of bedrock weathering or bedrock breaking down into soil. And even more specifically, I study how wind moving trees around contributes to the breaking down of bedrock into soil. And to do that, I use geophysical tools like seismology to study the actual vibrational signal in the Earth's surface that is associated with that process.
So, Mel, can you tell us why uh, understanding how bedrock turns into soil is something important?
Yeah, so there's many ways that rock can turn into soil, and this is just one incredibly specific method of doing that. But every aspect on a smaller scale, or every kind of micro component of bedrock weathering that we are able to understand better and possibly be able to make some quantitative estimates about how much of it is happening and when and where and what it might look like in the future as our planet changes. Every little bit of knowledge that we add to our overall understanding of a big picture process like soil production is going to help us just understand the process on a scientific level and do better and more accurate science. So that's kind of, it's kind of hard sometimes to keep that in mind when on a daily basis I'm working on such a micro scale of all of these processes and I'm studying something so super specific, but it all kind of adds, these are all puzzle pieces essentially that add to our big picture understanding of Earth's surface processes. So things like soil production and, how much soil exists where and how much of it moves and how quickly and from where to where, and how these things might change as the surface changes or as the climate changes. These are all important to understand for, people who live on the Earth's surface, because soil is a big part of ecology. It contributes to things like surface hazards, like landslides. It's important for things like agriculture and our overall subsistence. So there's many reasons why we need to understand soil production and all of the different facets of it.
Isn't it interesting how sometimes when you're working on something, you have to consistently redirect yourself to remind yourself that this is part of a bigger picture and you're only working on like this minute block of research, but it feels very grandiose.
It's definitely like one of those really regularly occurring internal struggles for myself, because I will have many days where it feels like I haven't made any progress because you know, I've spent the whole day dealing with something on a minute scale, like processing my data to be in the right shape or the right format so that I can actually make an accurate analysis out of it. And, on any given day, I'm not able to say, oh, at the end of the day, I have solved this problem or I understand this process so much better than I did before because of what I did today. That's definitely not the case. Like on a day-to-day basis, it's more like, was I able to actually, interpret my results correctly or make sure that I processed my data in the right way and I didn't make any mistakes and that my interpretation of my results is actually going to be accurate and help me say something that's true about the process that I'm studying. And it's kind of a existential crisis sometimes.
The PhD is an existential crisis, but I really like what you said, and I kind of want to put you on the spot for a second, just to reel our audience members back in who may not be familiar with some of the terms. Is it possible you could give me like a plain language summary of what you're referring to when you talk about seismology and some of the data that you're working with or tools that you're working with? Not necessarily results or anything. We know you're still work in process, but just kind of breaking it down in that plain language for a newcomer to understand what exactly you're talking about or what your current data looks like.
Yeah, definitely. So, seismology is the study of vibrations in the earth. And as a scientific discipline, it was originally developed to study the earth interior. And seismology is the reason why we know the structure of the earth's interior, that there's a core and a mantle and a crust. It's because people used vibrations going through the earth's body to figure out what the internal structure was. And what I do is actually environmental seismology. So the data that I work with is still data that tells us about how vibrations are propagating through the earth, but the level of depth of the earth that I focus on is, relatively speaking, incredibly shallow, because I look at the part of the earth's surface that actually interacts with things like vegetation. And so that's much more shallow than what a lot of traditional seismologists study, which is things like earthquakes, which can be, hundreds of kilometers deep. And I study things that occur on the, meter to tens of meters scale of depth. So the data that I work with is largely still seismic data, but it's data that tells us about what is happening on the surface level, not deep in the earth. And then in conjunction to the seismic data, I also use atmospheric data because, again, I study the interactions between the atmosphere and vegetation and the surface of the earth. So in order to be able to make linkages between those things, we need to know what's happening, not just on the Earth's surface, but also at the source. Or for my research topic, the source here would be the atmosphere. So it's the wind energy that gets captured by vegetation and transferred into the ground. So I do also work with atmospheric data that tells us things about the wind speed and the atmospheric pressure and how those things change over time. And I look at the linkage between what's happening in the atmosphere and what's happening in the ground.
All right. So just to shake things up a little, see what I did there? Seismology, shaking things up. Sorry.
Nice.
So we know that you're also interested in progressing academia and science toward equitable access, representation, and inclusivity. Can you tell us what that might look like in practice for you?
Yeah, for me, I am largely motivated by what kind of my personal experience has been, and also by what I see or who I see when I spend time in academic circles and in scientific circles, places like conferences or campuses, for example. And just from my personal lived experience, I am somebody who I don't see represented in I would say historical images of geoscientists. My parents are from China, and I was born in the United States as part of the first generation in our family to be born outside of China. And my parents grew up during the Cultural Revolution. So that was kind of a crazy time. And I see in many ways the privilege that I have as somebody who was born and mostly raised in the United States. I have a lot of privilege in that regard. I have definitely some economic privilege that allowed me to take the life steps that I was able to take up to this point. And then, kind of on the flip side of that, I've also really experienced feeling like certain circles are really not made for me or people like me. And the geoscience community is definitely a place that I have felt that. Granted, it's changing, but yeah, it wasn't made for women really, and it wasn't made for people of color. And I do still see a lot of that, even just on my own campus, and when I go to conferences and things like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, perfect. So thank you so much for that response, Mel. I feel like we're just kind of scratching the surface here, but maybe that's a conversation that we need to have you back on to expand on some more. But we have arrived at the time of our podcast where we play our favorite game. It's called Hot Potato. We here at the Geo Trip believe in balance. So aside from getting to know your technical background, we also just like to get a little individual insights about our guests. So Mel, are you ready to play Hot Potato?
I am.
All right. Question number one. If you had to choose a career for the remainder of your years, would you be a geoscientist or a fire dancer?
I would, for this one, I would definitely go with geoscientist. And I can say that very confidently because it's already a debate that I had with myself. And I already made the decision not to pursue a career in circus arts. And when I say that, I mean not as my, like, not as like my primary career. I do still do it. And I do pick up gigs and do kind of the odd work here and there as a circus artist, but I don't pursue it as just my main form of living or income. So here I am pursuing a geoscience career, and I'm definitely still choosing that track.
I love that you've actually had a debate about this with yourself. You're literally our first guest in Hot Potato who's like, man, I have actually thought about this. So I love it. First thing comes to mind, if you could safely explore, which would you pick, outer space or seafloor?
Oh my gosh. It's just funny that you asked that in the context of the whole Ocean Gate submersible scandal.
Oh my gosh, thinking about it, this script was written before Ocean Gate. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's just like, just like the context of the timing that you asked that is really funny to me. Someone is probably going to listen to that and think that I'm very evil for saying that. But I would go with outer space, and not just because of Ocean Gate, but I would go with outer space.
All right. Question number three, and it's okay. I think we all have a dark sense of humor on this podcast. Van life or permanent address life?
Oh my God.
First thing comes to mind.
Yeah, it's just, I have done both. I like stability, so I would go with a quote unquote permanent address. I mean, nothing's permanent, right? But if you're talking about like a sticks and bricks house versus living in a van full time, then I would choose a house for sure. But I like having the option of a van.
We're almost to the end. Question number 4. Freestyle or trials unicycle?
What does the second one mean?
Man, I like research unicycles because of you, Mel. Apparently, a trials. Okay, so briefly for our audience members, Mel actually gets around the campus of the Colorado School of Mines on a unicycle. And I am very fascinated anytime I'm walking and I see her whizzing by and she doesn't see me. So that's why I went down the rabbit hole of unicycles while we were prepping for this episode.
Okay. I wonder, yeah, it's an electric unicycle. So, you know, if you were researching unicycles, maybe you were finding different things because I'm not familiar with the kind of unicycle that you're talking about.
All right. So last question for you. This should be an easy one. What is the last show that you binge watched?
Oh man. Wednesday.
Ooh, good choice. Good choice. Nice.
I love that show.
I really enjoyed that show. It was background. It was supposed to be a background show, but somehow I got lost in like her very dark sense of humor.
Yeah, I love her. What's the name of that actress again?
Jenna Ortega.
Ortega, right.
Yeah, I really identify with Wednesday.
Well, Mel, having you on this episode of the Geo Trip to discuss your not easily categorized approach to the geosciences has been such a pleasure. And like I said before, it feels like we could go on talking for hours, but I really feel like we need to have you back on to continue this conversation, particularly about your research and your views on how we can progress towards a more equitable geoscience community. So as we close out, please let our listeners know where they can follow you or connect with you if you so desire.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It was super fun talking with you both. I don't have social media, so I can't give you those links or tell you where to find me. You can find me in the gaming community. I'm active on Twitch and Discord, but I don't do any of the other social platforms at the moment. And you can find me on our lab group's website. It's the Surface Processes group at the Colorado School of Mines, and I am on that page.
Listeners, on behalf of Liaika and myself, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Geo Trip. We'll be back next month with another exciting installment. But until then, you can also follow us on Twitter at GeoTrip Podcast. It's been a wonderful experience having you, Mel, and we look forward to having you back on again.
Looking forward to it as well.